Well, after such a climactic scene like the offering of Isaac in chapter 22, we sort of need a little time to rest, and the storyteller's about to give us that in the next stories. But I want you to focus first on what God does in response to what he saw in Abraham when Abraham offered Isaac on the altar. Because you have to remember, this was a test. God tested Abraham there, and God saw something in Abraham through that test. God saw the demonstration of Abraham's faith, and I think God even saw the demonstration of Abraham's love for God, because Abraham wouldn't hold back even the son that he loved so much if God wanted it, if God wanted that son. And so now look at chapter 22, verse 15, at how God responds to what he saw in Abraham. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that's on the seashore." You see how God responds to what he saw in the life of Abraham, what he saw in Abraham's heart? God says, because you've done that, I swear to you by myself that I will surely do what I promised. I'll bless you, and I'm going to multiply your offspring like the stars of heaven and the sand that's on the seashore. And then God goes on with brand new promises. Look at chapter 22, verse 17. God says, "And your offspring, Abraham, will possess the gate of his enemies." And I think the ESV is right there to translate that as a singular. Your offspring, Abraham, will possess the gate of his enemies. See, God's promising to Abraham many offspring. But Abraham, you're going to have an offspring who's going to crush his enemies. He's going to take down the gate of his enemies. He's going to conquer. And then we have to think, that sounds a lot like what God promised all the way back in Genesis 3, doesn't it? There would be conflict between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman. The battles would rage, but one day God promises that the offspring of the woman, he will crush the head of the serpent. He will win the battles. He will win the war, even against the serpent himself. And now God says to Abraham, because you've done this, I swear to you, Abraham, you'll have many offspring. But your offspring, one of them, will possess the gate of his enemies. And then God adds to it in verse 18 as well. Abraham, and in your offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you obeyed my voice. Now we hear that and we say, wait, didn't God already promise that? But I want you to think about the difference. In Genesis 12, God said something very similar. But listen to the difference. In Genesis 12, God said to Abram, when he was first going out, God said, look, Abram, in you, all the families on earth will be blessed. And now what does he say? Now that Abraham's an old man and he's got the son of promise, now God says, Abraham, in your offspring, all the nations on earth will be blessed. We're being pointed in the story of the Bible to now look to the next generation, to Abraham's offspring. It's going to be in his seed, in his offspring, that all the peoples on earth are going to receive the blessing of God. Abraham and Isaac pack up their stuff, head back to the two guys who are waiting for them, and head home with some incredible stories to tell. And now there's some rest in the stories as we go to chapters 23 and 24. Now, as we look at these two chapters, I want to remind us that there are many ways that storytellers can emphasize things, right? We've seen multiple different ways, and one that I want to highlight or bring back to your mind is that you can often tell what's really important to a storyteller by how much time the storyteller spends telling a particular story. And you have to keep that in mind when you read chapters 23 and 24, because these are two stories that at first glance probably don't seem that significant, and yet the storyteller takes a lot of time to tell the stories. So look at chapter 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Sarah dies. This is the curse coming to pass. She succumbs to the land. She returns to the dust because of sin, because of the curse. And it brings great grief to Abraham, who had journeyed so far, so many years, so many decades with the wife that he loved. And he weeps and mourns for her. And then for the next 19 verses, what we read is Abraham trying to buy a place in Canaan to bury his wife that he loves. And we read it and we're kind of like, why do we need to know these details? Because it's like Abraham goes to someone and says, hey, I want to buy a plot of land to bury my wife. And the guy's like, you're such a good man, Abraham, you just take the land. I don't want anything from you. No, Abraham says, no, I really want to buy it. And the guy's like, no, just take it. And no, Abraham is like, I am going to buy it from you. He says, okay. What's the deal with that? Why 20 verses about the burial plot that Abraham buys for Sarah? You know, some of these stories you can't be sure of everything that we're supposed to grasp from them, but I think at least two things stand out to me from this one. One is this, I think, is a way to show honor to Sarah. She's been an incredibly important woman in the story, and we get 20 verses about her death and burial. But another thing that stands out, maybe even more, is you have to think about Sarah and Abraham, that for over 60 years, they've been journeying, trusting the promise of God to give them the land of Canaan. And Sarah dies. And how much did she ever receive? Nothing. And Abraham, how much does he get? He gets this one small burial plot. This one piece of land is all that he ever owns. And you think, wow, they spent their whole life trusting that God would give them the land. And yet, they never got it. They never received themselves all that God had promised. They died still waiting. And that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. How do we reconcile that? Did they even go out with their hopes set only on receiving the land of Canaan in this life? I mean, these are questions that kind of stick with us in the story. But then you come into chapter 24, 67 verse long chapter. And the heading in my Bible says that it is about Isaac and Rebekah. Okay? Now what's going on? I mean, think 67 verses. This, I believe, is probably the longest chapter in the Bible so far. 67 verses about Isaac trying to find a wife. I mean, there are more verses given to this story than to the creation of the world in chapters 1 and 2 put together. Why? And when I say this is about Isaac trying to find a wife, maybe I should clarify. The world then is a little different than the world now. And I don't know, you could try to put yourself in Isaac's position here, because Isaac trying to find a wife is basically his dad trying to find him a wife. Abraham cares a lot for his son. Obviously, he loves his son, and he's really committed to find a wife for his son. But he does not want Isaac to marry a woman from the Canaanites. He wants Isaac to marry a woman of faith, a woman from his homeland. And so Abraham arranges not to send Isaac back to find a wife like we might think. Instead, Abraham goes to his servant, his faithful servant, and he sends his servant to try to find a wife for Isaac. And that's what's told over the course of 67 verses, that story. Say, why does it take so long to tell the story? One of the reasons it takes so long is that we're basically told the story of this servant going out, not really knowing how he's going to be able to find this woman, praying to the Lord that God would lead him to the right woman for Isaac. And then God leads him to this family. And then the man tells the whole story again that we just read. And so the story is really told like twice in the text. And this all raises the question for us, what's the big deal about this story? Why so many verses about this story? But it's an amazing story if you read it on your own. The man is led to this woman named Rebekah. He goes to the family. He tells them about Abraham, about Isaac, about what God is doing. And it's all going to come to this climax of, will Rebekah actually go with this man? And that's what I want to focus on. And when you think of why is this story so important, think of what happens when Rebekah is talking with her family and they need to know from her own lips, one thing. Look at Genesis 24 and look down at verse, let's pick up in verse 57. The family says to Rebekah, or to Abraham's servant, let us call the young woman and let's ask her. Basically, let's ask her what she wants to do. And so verse 58, they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And I want you to think about that. I mean, think about what she's being asked. Here she is, comfortable with her family, her kindred, in her own land. And she's being asked by her family, Rebekah, are you willing to go with this man that you hardly know, to go marry a man you don't know? Are you willing to go basically to a land you've never seen, trusting the promise of God? And when you think of it that way, say, you know what? Rebekah is basically being asked, are you willing to do the same thing as what other person? As Abraham and Sarah. Are you willing to leave everything behind, Rebekah, and go with this man to start a new life in a new land, trusting the promise of God? They want to know from her, will you go? And look at what she says in chapter 24, verse 58 at the end. And she said, I will go. And so they sent her away, and she goes, and you can imagine Isaac says, I think that he's out meditating in the field. He's probably been doing some praying of his own as he's waiting for the servant to come back with the woman that he's gonna marry. And he sees her, and they love each other, and it's a beautiful love story, and they get married, and Isaac is comforted through this after losing his mother, and it's a beautiful story. And again, we think 67 verses on that story. What are we supposed to gain from it? What are we supposed to see? I think at least one of the things that I just tried to highlight is the significance of Rebekah. She's being put in line with a guy like Abraham, a woman of faith who's willing to go out and venture out, trusting in the promise of God to a new land, to a new life. But also, I think you see from it, do you notice how important Abraham thought it was that his son has the right kind of woman to marry? If the hope of the world is in the woman and in her offspring, maybe it's really, really important that his son marries the right kind of woman. Maybe there's something for us to gain from that. Say, well, are we supposed to learn other things from this? You know, we could joke around and say, well, maybe we're supposed to learn principles of dating from this. I actually don't think that this would be my recommendation as a pastor for how you find a spouse. But I would say there's at least one other thing you should pick up from this story, and I think it's the most important thing in the story. And that's what I want you to see in verse 60, because I want you to see what the family says to Rebekah when they bless her, as she says, I'm ready to go. look at the blessing they give her in chapter 24, verse 60. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." Do you see it? Not only is Rebekah being put in parallel with Abraham, they bless Rebekah with virtually the same promises, the same blessings that God had said to Abraham. I'm going to multiply your offspring, and in your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed, and your offspring will possess the gate of his enemies. And now they say to Rebekah, "Oh, our sister, may you become thousands and 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." There are going to be innumerable offspring for Abraham, for Rebekah, but there will be one offspring that God will raise up, who will be a conquering son, who will crush his enemies, who will win not just the battle, who will win the war.